30 seconds that will change the way you hear his name. He was born in a 2-room wooden shack in Tupelo, Mississippi on a winter morning in 1935. His twin brother was stillborn. His father would go to prison before Elvis turned 4. There was no money, no safety, no promise of anything. And yet, 20 years later, his face was on the cover of every magazine in America. His voice had cracked open the wall between black music and white radio, and a nation that had never agreed on anything agreed on this. Elvis Presley was unlike anything the world had ever seen. This is not a coincidence. This is astrology. Elvis was a Capricorn, governed by Saturn, the planet of discipline, time, ambition, and consequence. And everything that defined his life, his ascent from nothing, his iron work ethic, his obsessive need for control in love, his tragic self-destruction behind golden gates, all of it was written in the stars the moment he drew his first breath on January 8, 1935. Saturn gives everything, and then Saturn collects. This is the story of how the cosmos shaped the king, and how the king ultimately could not escape what the cosmos had planned for him. To understand Elvis Presley, you must first understand what it means to be born under the sign of the sea goat. Capricorn is the 10th sign of the zodiac, a cardinal earth sign ruled by Saturn, and it carries within it a paradox that defines every soul born beneath it. The deepest hunger for achievement, combined with an intimate, almost cellular knowledge of hardship. Capricorn does not dream of success the way a Sagittarius does, with fire and improvisation. Capricorn builds, Capricorn endures, Capricorn climbs. Elvis Aaron Presley was born into a family that had nothing. His father, Vernon Presley, worked odd jobs that barely fed the family. His mother, Gladys, worked in a garment factory. They lived in East Tupelo, one of the poorest communities in one of the poorest states in the country. The house where Elvis was born, 2 rooms, no indoor plumbing, still stands today as a museum, and it is impossible to walk through it without feeling the weight of what he overcame. This is pure Capricorn territory. Saturn, Capricorn's ruling planet, is the great taskmaster of the solar system. In ancient astrology, it was known as the Greater Malefic, the planet of restriction, delay, and hard-won lessons. But Saturn is also the planet of mastery. What it denies early, it eventually rewards, but only to those who do not quit. The Capricorn soul is built for the long game. It does not expect shortcuts. It expects to earn. Elvis earned. From the age of 10, he was obsessed with music. He taught himself guitar. He listened to gospel in church and rhythm and blues on the radio. He absorbed everything. When his family moved to Memphis in 1948, he was 13 years old, and he was already forming the musical identity that would eventually detonate across American culture. He was not a prodigy in the conventional sense. He was not discovered playing Carnegie Hall or handed a recording contract as a child. He worked. He played. He listened. He practiced. The Capricorn archetype is frequently described as the figure who arrives late to the party, but arrives in a limousine. Elvis walked into Sun Records on Union Avenue in Memphis in 1953, paying $4 out of his own pocket to record a birthday song for his mother. He was 18 years old, wearing a pink shirt and a ducktail, and he was so nervous his voice cracked on the first take. He came back the next year, and the year after that. Capricorn does not give up. When producer Sam Phillips finally gave Elvis a proper session in the summer of 1954, pairing him with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, something extraordinary happened. They had been working for hours, getting nowhere, when Elvis picked up his guitar and started playing an old Arthur Crudup song called "That's All Right" with an abandon that was pure freedom. It was the sound of a young man who had spent years suppressing his instincts, finally letting them run. Saturn had held him tightly long enough. Now it released him, and the world shook. That single record, released in July 1954, transformed American music overnight. But the transformation did not happen because Elvis was lucky. It happened because he had spent years building the instrument of himself, his voice, his ear, his instinct, his confidence, with the quiet, relentless dedication that is the signature of every great Capricorn. He was 20 years old, and he had already done 10 years of invisible work. Saturn rewards those who pay the price. He did not fall into greatness. He built it brick by brick in the dark, when nobody was watching. The Capricorn desire for achievement is never purely about money or fame, though both may follow. At its deepest level, it is about proving something, to the world, and more urgently, to oneself. Elvis grew up hearing that people like him did not make it. He grew up surrounded by a poverty that was not just material, but psychological. The poverty of low expectation, of limited horizons, of a world that told poor boys from Mississippi to stay in their lane. Capricorn does not accept lanes. It makes its own road. And Elvis made a road so wide that an entire civilization walked down it behind him, and is still walking down it today. If Capricorn gave Elvis the spine to climb, it was his moon in Pisces that gave him the heart, enormous, porous, and ultimately impossible to protect. In astrology, the moon governs the emotional interior, the unconscious self, the place where a person goes when the public is not watching. Elvis's moon in Pisces tells us everything about who he was when the stage went dark. Pisces is the 12th and final sign of the zodiac, the sign of dissolution, of mysticism, of compassion so deep it becomes self-sacrifice, and of escapism so powerful it can swallow a life whole. A moon in Pisces. Person does not simply feel emotions. They absorb them from everyone around them all the time without a filter. They are psychic sponges. They love with a completeness that most people cannot imagine, and they suffer in a way that most people cannot sustain. The central love story of Elvis's life is, of course, with Priscilla Ann Beaulieu. He met her in 1959 at a party in Bad Nauheim, Germany, where he was stationed during his military service. She was 14 years old. He was 24. It was an encounter that would define and haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. Elvis was captivated immediately, and he spent years arranging for Priscilla to come to Memphis, eventually convincing her parents to allow her to move into Graceland in 1963 on the condition that she finish high school there. What followed was one of the most psychologically complex love stories of the 20th century. Elvis loved Priscilla with a Capricorn's possessiveness and a Pisces moon's total devotion. He chose her hair color, jet black, to match his own. He chose her clothes. He told her how to speak in public, what to think, what to read. This was not cruelty. It was, in its distorted way, the deepest expression of the Capricorn need to protect and control what it values most. For Elvis, loving someone meant making them safe, and making them safe meant making them entirely his. But Pisces moon adds another layer entirely. Elvis carried within him an almost oceanic capacity for tenderness. Former members of his inner circle, the so-called Memphis Mafia, described a man who wept easily, who gave away cars and jewelry to strangers on a whim, who prayed on his knees every night, who was genuinely shattered by the suffering of others. He gave millions of dollars to charity, anonymously. He would stop concerts to comfort audience members who had fainted. He called his mother every single day of his life until she died. The death of Gladys Presley in August 1958, when Elvis was just 23 years old, was a wound that never healed. His moon in Pisces had formed its deepest bond with her, the woman who had poured everything she had into a son she believed was destined for something extraordinary. When she died at 46 of a heart attack, Elvis collapsed. He had to be physically held at the graveside. He wept openly and without embarrassment. He kept repeating, according to those present, that she was gone, and that he had never gotten to do all the things he wanted to do for her. This is the Pisces moon in its most devastating expression, love without reservation and grief without shore. The same quality that made Elvis such a magnetic performer, his capacity to feel everything in real time, to transmit raw emotion through a microphone, also left him completely undefended against his own pain. He had no emotional walls. He had no mechanism for processing loss except to drown it in something else. He loved without limits, and love without limits always finds a way to become loss. After Priscilla left in 1972, having grown, finally and courageously, beyond the image Elvis had constructed for her, he never recovered emotionally. He dated compulsively, filling the void with young women who admired him but could not reach him. His Pisces moon, searching always for that perfect oceanic union, kept looking for something that could not be found, not in another person, not in applause, and eventually not even in the pills that were prescribed to him in increasing quantities throughout the 1970s. The escapism of Pisces, its tendency to flee reality rather than face it, finally consumed the very heart it had helped to create. The man who had once cried at his mother's grave because he had not done enough for her spent his final years unable to do enough for himself. The Pisces moon that had made him the most emotionally alive performer of his generation had become, at last, a sea with no bottom, and Elvis was drowning in it. There is a question that every Elvis biographer eventually encounters, and none of them fully answers. What was it? What was the quality that turned a truck driver from Memphis into a global phenomenon? Because talent, extraordinary as his was, does not explain it entirely. There were other talented singers in 1954. There were other handsome young men with electric voices and restless energy. But there was only one Elvis. There was only one person who walked into a room and made every single person in it feel chosen, feel seen, feel as though something important was about to happen. The answer lives in his Sagittarius ascendant. In astrology, the ascendant, also called the rising sign, is the mask the world sees. It is the energy that greets strangers, the first impression that burns itself into memory, the quality people describe when they say, "There is something about him." The ascendant is not the inner self. That belongs to the sun and moon, but it is the outer self, the performance, the presence. And Elvis's outer self was pure Sagittarius, expansive, magnetic, joyful, and burning with a fire that pulled everything around it into orbit. Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system, and the one associated in ancient astrology with abundance, luck, vision, and the capacity to inspire. Jupiter-ruled individuals have a quality that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. They make life feel bigger when they are in it. They expand the room. They make the ordinary feel mythological. Elvis did this to people in a way that no subsequent performer has ever quite replicated, not because of technique, but because of sheer, overwhelming presence. His first national television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on September 9, 1956, was watched by 60 million people, approximately 60% of the entire American population at the time. The cameras famously filmed him only from the waist up after his movements caused a national controversy. But even from the waist up, even with the most provocative elements of his performance hidden, he was overwhelming. The studio audience screamed so loudly that the sound engineers could barely record the music. That is not talent alone. That is Jupiter. The Sagittarius ascendant also explains Elvis's legendary generosity, the quality that made him, in the words of those who knew him, the most genuinely kind, famous person they had ever encountered. Sagittarius is a sign of philosophical largeness. It thinks in terms of humanity rather than transactions. Elvis gave away houses to strangers. He gave away cars to people he had met an hour before. He tipped waitresses with $100 bills. He funded the college educations of young women he had never met simply because he heard they needed help. He could not pass suffering without responding to it, not because his publicist told him to, but because the Jupiter fire inside him could not be contained. He was the room, not just in the room. He was the room itself, and the room never got to rest. But the Sagittarius ascendant also carries a shadow that Elvis lived out with painful clarity, the inability to be small. Jupiter does not do moderation. It does not do quiet. It does not do retreat. And when the world Elvis had expanded into became too much, when the tours became jails and the adoration became noise, he could not simply step back. He could not disappear into a private life the way other artists did. The Sagittarius fire kept him in the spotlight, even when the spotlight was burning him alive. By the early 1970s, Elvis had retreated almost entirely into Graceland, surrounding himself with a rotating cast of friends and employees who were paid implicitly to reflect his greatness back at him. The Sagittarius ascendant, which had once radiated outward and embraced the entire world, had turned inward and become something dangerous. A man who needed constant affirmation because he had lost the ability to believe in his own worth when no one was watching. The Las Vegas years, the jumpsuits, the scarves, the shows performed in a chemical haze, were the Sagittarius ascendant running on fumes. The fire was still there, flickering, occasionally roaring back with moments of transcendent brilliance. But the fuel was depleting, and a Sagittarius without fuel is not a quiet, diminished thing. It is a conflagration that has run out of anything left to burn, except itself. Every Capricorn life contains, if you look closely enough, a Saturnian reckoning. Saturn, the ruling planet of the sign, moves slowly, taking approximately 29 years to complete one orbit of the Sun. Every 29 years, it returns to the position it occupied at the moment of your birth, an event astrologers call the Saturn return, and it demands an accounting. It asks, have you built something true? Have you lived according to your deepest values? Have you paid the price that genuine growth requires? If the answer is no, Saturn dismantles what was built on false foundations, without exception, without mercy, without apology. Elvis's first Saturn return occurred in 1964 when he was 29 years old. He was, at that point, the most famous entertainer on the planet. But he had also retreated entirely from live performance, locked into a contract with his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, that required him to make a series of increasingly formulaic Hollywood films. He was making money on an unprecedented scale. He was also, by every credible account, profoundly bored, creatively suffocated, and quietly desperate. Saturn was asking its question, is this what you truly are? And Elvis, surrounded by yes-men and contractual obligations, did not answer. He answered in 1968 with the NBC television special, now simply known as the '68 Comeback Special. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of popular entertainment. Elvis appeared on stage in black leather, lean and electric and slightly dangerous, and performed with a ferocity that had been absent for nearly a decade. In the middle of the show, he sat with a small band in an intimate setting and played and talked and laughed with an honesty that left the audience breathless. He sweated. He joked. He was, for 90 minutes, entirely and undeniably himself. The '68 special is often read simply as a comeback. It was something more profound than that. It was a Capricorn rebuilding his own foundation, demonstrating to himself, not to Colonel Parker, not to RCA Records, not to the screaming audience, but to himself, that the real thing was still inside him. Saturn had collected the mediocre years. Now it was returning what had always been real, but the second half of his life tells a different and darker story. The 1970s brought a creative resurgence, extraordinary recordings, thrilling early Las Vegas performances, but they also brought the full machinery of exploitation into operation. Colonel Parker booked him into shows relentlessly, year after year. The pharmaceutical regimen that had begun as a way to manage performance anxiety expanded into a multi-physician, multi-pharmacy operation that supplied Elvis with staggering quantities of prescription drugs. He gained and lost weight dramatically. He canceled shows. He performed in a fog so thick that audiences sometimes could not tell what they were witnessing. The people around him enabled it because they were paid to enable it. The Capricorn tendency toward isolation, the sign's instinct to build walls, to trust the inner circle and no one else, to surround itself with loyal lieutenants who love the king but are also financially dependent on the king's continuation, had become a prison with golden bars. Graceland was a palace. Graceland was a cell. The Memphis Mafia kept the outside world away from Elvis, and in doing so, kept Elvis away from any honest reckoning with what was actually happening to him. He lived in a palace surrounded by people who loved him, and he was completely, catastrophically alone. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the bathroom floor of Graceland. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, but the toxicology report revealed 14 different drugs in his system. All of them prescribed, all of them legal, none of them challenged by anyone with the courage to say no to the most famous man in the world. Saturn had collected, finally and completely. The price of the life it had built was paid in full. And yet, and here lives the deepest mystery of Capricorn, the paradox that beats at the heart of the sign. The legacy of Elvis Presley did not die on that bathroom floor. It grew. It expanded beyond anything that had existed during his lifetime. His music is played every day on every continent. His image is one of the most recognized in human history. Graceland receives more visitors annually than the White House. The poor boy from Tupelo who climbed from nothing became in death, a myth as durable and vast as any the ancient world ever produced. This, too, is Saturn. Saturn does not only take, it also preserves. The things built with genuine labor, with the real material of talent and sacrifice and authentic feeling, do not decay with the body that made them. They endure. They outlast everything. Elvis spent 42 years paying Saturn's price. The poverty, the relentless work, the loneliness, the physical and psychological cost of being the vessel through which an entire era's hunger for beauty, freedom, and transgression was expressed and released. Saturn received every installment of that payment, and in return, it gave him something that money cannot buy and time cannot erode. It gave him forever. The king is dead. The king will never die. January 8, 1935 to August 16, 1977. Saturn's child, forever.